Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our buddy read of Mr. Scarborough's Family by Anthony Trollope. An enhanced buddy read, because we're not just reading it together, I'm reading it to you, with copious editorial interruptions. Uh, which I defend because it seems to be the only BookTube related thing that I can do well. I can't do a writing clinic, I can't do a book club, but we can do this. And we are in the thick of the story here. We're about a third of the way through. This is my I'll finish this later bookmark. uh, and we are following Mr. Gray, who is Mr. Scarborough's lawyer. He is the one who's been dragged into Mr. Scarborough's elaborate plan to declare to the world and prove it legally that his eldest son Montjoy is illegitimate, and that therefore the staggering amount of debt that he has raised against the prospect of inheriting Tretton Park is invalid. His debtors can go to the moon for it, because they're not going to get anything from him. He has no legal grounds to raise money against the expectation of inheriting because he's not legitimate. And the second son, Augustus, is a worm and dislikable, but has no debts, has raised no money against the estate, and is now looking to inherit everything clean and proper. It's not very proper. That's bothering Mr. Gray. He thinks that, correctly, that Mr. Scarborough has hated the entail laws of his country so much that he has been a scapegrace when it comes to the law, and made a fool of Mr. Gray, in addition to besmirching the name of his late wife. But Mr. Gray has gone down to Tretton Park anyway, with the papers to confront Mr. Scarborough, so that they can talk about it face to face, and also so that they can deal with a bit of business, which cropped up explicitly in the last chapter, which is that although Mr. Scarborough is blithe to the whole idea of this crowd of creditors, of moneylenders, Augustus Scarborough, the now heir to Tretton Park, is not blithe to them, and would kind of like to have them leave him and the property alone by settling Montjoy Scarborough's debts, by settling the debts of his older brother. Not paying them, settling them. So the moneylenders would not get everything that they are expecting, or that they would have been promised. They're not getting the ownership, for instance, of Tretton Park. They're not getting anything like that, but at least they'll get something. They're in Augustus Scarborough, and I guess by extension Mr. Scarborough doesn't care, are in a perfect position to negotiate with these moneylenders, because the moneylenders will get nothing otherwise. And Augustus Scarborough is thinking, if money can be raised on the estate without hurting the estate, to pay off these men and get them to tear up the bills that they owe, so that no one has anything against the estate, well, then we should do it. We already have been told that Tretton Park is increasing in value. That seems likely to continue. So it's Augustus Scarborough is thinking it's a good gamble, and Mr. Gray is necessary, because Mr. Scarborough, old Mr. Scarborough, Squire Scarborough, will not do anything just on Augustus's say-so. He clearly does not like his younger son, and his younger son doesn't like him. And that's where we are now. Mr. Gray is down at Tretton Park, and we are at chapter 20, Mr. Gray's opinion of the Scarborough family. Had Augustus been really anxious to see Mr. Gray before Mr. Gray went to his father, he would probably have managed to do so. He did not always tell Mr. Jones, that is Septimus Jones, his hanger-on, everything. So the fellow has hurried up to the governor the moment he came into the house, he said. He's with him now, meaning Mr. Gray gets to the house and goes straight to Mr. Scarborough. He isn't bothering to pay his respects to Augustus Scarborough. Of course he is. Never mind, I'll be even with him in the long run. Then he greeted the lawyer with a mock courtesy as soon as he saw him. I hope your journey has done you no harm, Mr. Gray. If you're feeling the urge to boo and hiss whenever Augustus Scarborough is on the stage, feel free. You have my permission. Not in the least. It's very kind of you, I'm sure, to look after our poor concerns with so much interest. Jones, don't you think that it is the time they gave us some dinner? Mr. Gray, I'm sure, must want his dinner. All in good time, said the lawyer. You shall have your dinner, Mr. Gray. It is the least we can do for you. Mr. Gray felt that in every sound of his voice there was an insult, and took special notice of every tone, and booked them all down in his memory. After dinner he asked some unimportant questions with reference to the meeting that was to take place in the morning, and was at once rebuked. I do not know that we need trouble our friend here with our private concerns, he said. Augustus Scarborough is rebuking him because Septimus Jones is in the room. And it's a false rebuke, as Mr. Gray says immediately. Not in the least, said Mr. Gray. You have already been talking about them in my presence and in his. It is necessary that I should have a list of the creditors before I can advise your father. I don't see it. But, however, that is for you to judge. Indeed, I do not know on what points my father wants your advice. A lawyer generally furnishes such a list. Then Mr. Gray took up a book and was soon left alone by the younger men. It's about as uncivil as two people can be to each other in very polite Victorian society. In the morning, he walked out in the park so as to have free time for thought. Not a word further had been said between him and Augustus touching their affairs. At breakfast, Augustus discussed with his friend the state of the odds respecting some race, and then the characters of certain ladies. No subject could have been less interesting to Mr. Gray, as Augustus was aware. They breakfasted at 10, and at 12 had been named for the meeting. Mr. Gray had an hour and a half for his walk, in which he could turn over in his mind all these matters, of which his thoughts had been full for now many a day. Of 2 or 3 facts he was certain. Augustus was the legitimate heir of his father. Of that he had seen ample documentary evidence. The word of no Scarborough should go for anything with him, and of that fact he was assured. Whether the squire knew aught of Montjoy he did not feel sure, but that Augustus he was quite certain. So he doesn't know whether or not old Mr. Scarborough knows anything about Montjoy's current circumstances or whereabouts, but he knows that Augustus knows something. Who was paying the bills for the scapegrace during his travels, he could not say, but he thought it probable that Augustus was finding the money. And keep in mind, Augustus was a lawyer. He was earning money of his own, a good income on his own. It's not like the estate is everything that he has or ever could have. Montjoy, was kept away so as to be out of the creditor's way. He thought, therefore, that Augustus was doing this so that he might be more easily buy up the debts. But why should Augustus go to the expense of buying up the debts, seeing that the money must ultimately come out of his own pocket? Because, so Mr. Gray thought, Augustus would not trust his own father. The creditors, if they could get hold of Montjoy, would, when his father was dead and when the bonds would all become payable, might possibly so unravel the facts as to make it apparent that after all the property was Montjoy's. This was not Mr. Gray's idea, but was Mr. Gray's idea of a calculation which Augustus was making for his own government. According to Mr. Gray's reading of all the facts of the case, such were the suspicions that Augustus entertained in the matter. Otherwise, why should he be so anxious to take a step which would redound only to the advantage of the creditors? He was quite certain that no money would be paid, at any rate by Augustus, solely in the view of honestly settling their claims. So, according to Mr. Gray's way of looking at things, Augustus is worried that if his brother shows up, if he comes back home, and the creditors get a hold of him, somehow they might invalidate this change in the entail. Somehow. But there was another subject which troubled his mind excessively as he walked across the park. Why should he soil his hands, or at any rate trouble his conscience, with an affair so unclean, so perplexed, and so troublesome? Why was he there at Tretton at all to be insulted by a young blackguard such as he believed Augustus Scarborough to be? Augustus Scarborough, he knew, suspected him. But he, in return, suspected Augustus Scarborough. The creditors suspected him. Montjoy suspected him. The squire did not suspect him, but he suspected the squire. Keep in mind how honest Mr. Gray is. This must be a nightmare. He never could again feel himself to be on comfortable terms of trusting legal friendship with a man who has so played a prank in reference to his marriage as this man had performed. Why, then, should he still be concerned in a matter so distasteful to him? Why should he not wipe his hands of it all and retreat? There was no act of Parliament compelling him to meddle with this dirt. That is the advice of his daughter, Dolly. Such were his thoughts. But yet he knew he was compelled. He did feel himself bound to look after interests which he had taken in hand now for many years. It had been his duty, or the duty of someone belonging to him, to see into the deceit by which an attempt had been made to rob Augustus Scarborough of his patrimony. It had been his duty, for a while, to protect Montjoy, and the creditors who lent their money to Montjoy, from what he believed to be a flagitious attempt. False. is a good enough word, Tony. Then, as soon as he felt that the flagitious attempt had been made previously in Montjoy's favor, it became his duty to protect Augustus, in spite of the strong personal dislike for which he had first conceived for that young man. And then he, doubtless, had been attracted by the singularity of all that had been done in the affair, and of all that was likely to be done. He had said to himself that the matter should be made straight, and that he should make it straight. Therefore, during his walk in the park, he resolved that he must persevere. I'm glad that Trollope adds this last note. A less assured author might have been tempted to overlook it, which is in addition to everything else, in addition to the fact that Mr. Grey feels compelled, in addition to the fact that Mr. Grey's father represented Mr. Scarborough's father, in addition to all of that, it's interesting. The whole thing is interesting. At 12 o'clock, he was ready to be taken up to the sick man's rooms. When he entered it, under the custody of Miss Scarborough, that is, Mr. Scarborough's sister, who's taking care of him, he found that Augustus was there. The squire was sitting up with his feet supported and was apparently in good humor. "Well, Mr. Grey," he said, "have you settled this matter with Augustus?" So, all of you out there who are Mr. Scarborough fans will now be cheering because you're getting another scene with the old man. And I'm cheering too, because rogue though he might be, I think he's wonderful. "I have settled nothing." "He has not spoken to me about it at all," said Augustus. "I told him I wanted a list of the creditors. He said that it was my duty to supply it. That was the extent of our conversation, which he thought it expedient to have in the presence of my friend, Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones is very well in his way, but he is not acquainted with all my affairs. Your son, Mr. Scarborough, has made no tender to me of any information. Nor, sir, has Mr. Grey sought for any information from me." Not true. During this little dialogue, Mr. Scarborough turned his face with a smile from one to the other without a word. They're attacking each other in front of him. But only Augustus Scarborough is lying. Mr. Grey did ask for a list of creditors. "If Mr. Grey has anything to suggest in the way of advice, let him suggest it," said Augustus. "Now, Mr. Grey," said the squire with the same smile. "Till I get further information," said Mr. Grey, "I can only limit myself to giving the advice which I offered to you yesterday." "Perhaps you will repeat it, so that he may hear it," said the squire. "If you get a list of those to whom your son Montjoy owes money, and an assurance that the moneys named in that list had been from time to time lent by them to him, the actual amount, I mean, then I think that, if you and your son Augustus shall together choose to pay those amounts, you will make the best reparation in your power for the injury you have no doubt done in having contrived that it should be understood that Montjoy was legitimate." "You need not discuss," said the squire, "any injuries that I have done. I have done a great many, no doubt. But," continued the lawyer, he's a little bit sick of Mr. Scarborough constantly defending himself. "But," continued the lawyer, "before any such payment is made, close inquiry should be instituted as to the amounts of money which have absolutely passed." So Mr. Grey is underscoring a point that was made in the last chapter, which is that these moneylenders are talking about all sorts of stuff. But how much money did Montjoy Scarborough actually get? Let's not talk for a minute about usurious interest rates, or about promises, or even about promissory notes. How much cash did these moneylenders actually part with? The idea being, the rough calculation being, that that is at least what they should be paid, the actual money that they have given out. We should certainly be taken in," said the squire. "I have great admiration for Mr. Samuel Hart," that's one of the creditors. "I do believe that it would be found impossible to extract the truth from Mr. Samuel Hart. If Mr. Samuel Hart does not make money yet out of poor Montjoy, I shall be surprised." "The truth may be ascertained," said Mr. Grey. "You should get some accountant to examine the checks." "When I remember how easy it was to deceive some really clever men as to the evidence of my marriage," began Mr. Scarborough. "Mr. Grey is one of those men. He's the foremost of those men." So the squire began, but then stopped himself with a shrug of his shoulders. Among the really clever men who had been easily deceived, Mr. Grey was, if not actually the first in importance, foremost at any rate in name. "The truth may be ascertained," Mr. Grey repeated, almost with a scowl of anger upon his brow. "Well, yes, I suppose it may. It will be difficult in opposition to Mr. Samuel Hart. You must satisfy yourselves, at any rate. These men will know that they have no hope of otherwise getting a shilling." It is a little hard to make them believe anything, said the squire. They fancy, you know, that if they could get a hold of Montjoy so as to have him in their hands when the breath is out of my body and the bonds are really due, then it may be made to turn out that he was really the heir. We know that it is not so, said Mr. Grey. At this, Augustus smiled blandly. We know. But is that what we can make Mr. Samuel Hart know? In truth, Mr. Samuel Hart never allows himself to know anything, except the amount of money which he has made at his banker's. And it would be difficult to convince Mr. Tyrrwhit, that's another creditor. Mr. Tyrrwhit is assured that all of us, you and I, Montjoy and Augustus, are in a conspiracy to cheat him and the others. I don't wonder at it, said Mr. Grey. Perhaps not, continued the squire. The circumstances, no doubt, are suspicious, but he will have to find out his mistake. Augustus is very anxious to pay these poor men their money. It is a noble feeling on the part of Augustus. You must admit that, Mr. Grey. The irony with which this was said was only evident in the squire's face and voice. Augustus only quietly laughed. The attorney sat as firm as death. He was not going to argue with such a statement or laugh at such a joke. I will suppose it to come to over 100,000 pounds. 80,000, I should think, said Augustus. The bonds amount to a great deal more than that, twice that. It is for him to judge, said the squire, whether he is bound by his honour to pay so large a sum to men whom I do not suppose he loves very well. The estate can bear it, said Augustus. All right. The estate can. It's not 100% clear there, but it's clear that Augustus is thinking of paying 80,000 pounds, and the estate can bear that. So this is a pretty wealthy estate. That is a huge amount of money. That the estate can bear it without going broke, in other words, with keeping the butcher's bill coming. Yes, the estate can bear it, said the attorney. They should be paid what they have expended. That is my idea. If your son thinks that silence will be worth the money, just what they've expended, not anything else. What makes you say that? Demanded Augustus. Just my own opinion. I look upon it as an insult. Would you be kind enough to explain to us what is your reason for wishing us to do this thing? Asked Mr. Grey. No, sir, I decline to give any reason, but those which you ascribe to me are insulting. Will you deny them? I will not assent to anything coming from you, nor will I deny anything. It is altogether out of your place as an attorney to ascribe motives to your clients. Can you raise the money so that it will be forthcoming at once? That is the question. On your father's authority, backed by his signature, I imagine that I can do so, but I will not answer as a certainty. The best thing would be to sell a portion of the property. If you and your father will join, and Montjoy also with you, it may be done. What has Montjoy got to do with it? Asked the father. You had better have Montjoy also. There may be some doubt as to the title. People will think so after the tricks have been played. This was said by the lawyer, but the squire only laughed. He always showed some enjoyment of the fun which arose from the effects of his own scheming. The legal world, with its entails, had endeavored to dispose of his property, but he had shown the legal world that it was not an easy task to dispose of anything in which he was concerned. How will you get hold of Montjoy? Asked Augustus. Then the two older men only looked at each other. Both of them believed that Augustus knew more about his brother than anyone else. I think you had better send to Mr. Annesley and ask him. What does Mr. Annesley know about him? Asked the squire. He was the last person who saw him, at any rate in London. Are you sure of that? Said Mr. Grey. Unbelievable, the effrontery of Augustus Scarborough here, saying, how do we even know where Montjoy is? Maybe you should ask Harry Annesley. He was the last person to see him, when Augustus knows perfectly well where he is and has been paying for him the whole time. I think that I may say that I am. I think at any rate that I know there was a violent quarrel between them in the streets, a quarrel in which the two men proceeded to blows, and that Harry Annesley struck him in such a way as to leave him for dead upon the pavement. Then the young man walked away, and Montjoy has not been heard of, or at least has not been seen, since. That a man should have struck such a blow, and then, on the spur of the moment, thinking of his own safety, should have left his opponent, I can understand. I should not like to be accused of such treatment myself, but I can understand it. I cannot understand that a man should have been missing altogether, and then that he should have held his tongue. How do you know all of this? Asked the attorney. It is sufficient that I do know it. I don't believe a word of it, said the squire. Coming from you, of course, I must put up with any contradiction, said Augustus. I should not bear it from anyone else. And he looked at the attorney. One has a right to ask for your authority, said the father. I cannot give it. No, you can't, you lying sack of crap. Of course you can't give it. You're the authority. I cannot give it. A lady is concerned whose name I shall not mention. Yes, I'm afraid, as you can tell from this conversation, this heated conversation, the novel Anthony Trollope is gradually, slowly getting us back to Harry Annesley and Florence Mountjoy. But it is of less importance as his own friends are acquainted with the nature of his conduct. Indeed, it seems odd that you two gentlemen are so ignorant as to the matter which has been subject of common conversation in most circles. His uncle means to cut him out of the property. Can he too deal with entails? Said the squire. He is still in middle life, and he can marry. That is what he intends to do, so much that he is disgusted with his nephew. He has already stopped the young man's allowance, and swears that he shall not have a shilling of his money if he can help it. The police for some time were in great doubt whether they would not arrest him. I think I am justified in saying that he's a thorough reprobate. You are not at all justified, said his father. I can only express my own opinion, and I am glad to say that the world agrees with me. It is sickening, absolutely sickening, said the squire, turning to the attorney. You would not believe now. But he stopped himself. What would not Mr. Gray believe? Asked the son. There is no one who knows better than you after the row in the street. When Mountjoy was, I believe, the aggressor, he was again seen by another person. I hate such deceit and scheming. Here Augustus smiled. What are you sniggering at there, you blockhead? Mr. Scarborough has said he hates deceit and scheming. And Augustus Scarborough can't help but laugh. And you know that during all of this, Mr. Gray wants to be anywhere in the world but in this room. Your hatred, sir, at deceit and scheming. The truth is that when a man plays a game well, he does not like to find that he has any equal. Heaven forbid that I should say there was a rival here. You, sir, are so preeminently the first that no one can touch you. Then he laughed long, a low, bitter, inaudible laugh, during which Mr. Gray sat silent. This comes well from you, said the father. Well, sir, you would try your hand upon me. I have passed over all that you have done on my behalf, but when you come to abuse me, I cannot quite take your word as calmly as though there had been no, shall I say, antecedents. Now about this money, are we to pay it? They've all but accused each other of lying to each other's faces. These father and son hate each other. I don't care one straw about the money. What is it to me? I don't owe these creditors anything. Nor do I. Let them rest, then, and do the worst they can. But on the whole, Mr. Gray, he added, after a pause, I think we'd better pay them. They have endeavored to be insolent to me, and have therefore ignored their claim. I have told them to do their worst. If my son here will agree with you in raising the money, and if Mountjoy, as he too is necessary, will do so, I too will do what is required of me. If £80,000 will settle it all, there ought not to be any difficulty. You can inquire what the real amount would be. If they choose to hold to their bonds, nothing will come of it. That's all. So that is the plan. The bonds are for whatever money changed hands plus interest and then more interest and then more interest at 20, 30, 40% interest. No one can expect that anymore from a disinherited guy, from a disinherited spendthrift. No one can expect that. So just the bond, just the money that changed hands. Very well, Mr. Scarborough. Then I shall know how to proceed. I understand that Mr. Scarborough, Jr. is an assenting party. Mr. Scarborough, Jr. signified his assent by nodding his head. That will do, then, for I think that I have a little exhausted myself. Then he turned round upon his couch as though he intended to slumber. The he here is Mr. Scarborough. Trollope is again, all throughout this book, having pronoun problems, just a bit. Mr. Gray left the room, and Augustus followed him, and not a word was spoken between them. Mr. Gray had an early dinner and went up to London by an evening train. What became of Augustus he did not inquire, but simply asked for his dinner and for a conveyance to the train. These were forthcoming, and he returned at that night to Fulham, his home. So all he wants is ask the majordomo or the Carstairs or whatever, get me my supper, serve it to me, and then get me a fly to the train station on time. Well, said Dolly, as soon as he had got himself in slippers and made him his tea, I wish with all my heart I had never seen anyone of the name of Scarborough. That is, of course, but what have you done? The father has been a great knave. He has set the laws of his country at defiance, and should be punished most severely. And Mountjoy Scarborough has proved himself to be quite unfit to have any money in his hands. And a man so reckless is little better than a lunatic. But compared to Augustus, they are both estimable, amiable men. The father has ideas of philanthropy, and Mountjoy is simply mad. But Augustus is as dishonest as either of them, and is odious also all around. Then at length he explained all that he had learned and all that he had advised, and at last went to bed, combating Dolly's idea that the Scarboroughs ought now to be thrown over altogether. So she ends the chapter by repeating to him the advice that she has given him all along, which is just drop this whole thing. Get away from these people. If you say that you don't want anything to do with anyone named Scarborough, then don't. There is no act of Parliament that says you have to. Put all the documents in a burlap sack and hand it right back to them. It's unlikely that he's going to be able to do that, but he has returned now. So he has been down to Tretton Park, and a deal has been struck, an arrangement has been made. All three Scarborough men need to be involved in it. But if all three of them agree and do the requisite paperwork, once Mr. Grey has decided how much is actually owed, £80,000, let's say, the estate can bear it, the estate can raise it, the men can be paid off, and that'll be that. So that's where we are now. So where are we going next? Are we going to check out on Harry Ainsley? Somehow check back on Captain Montjoy? Or are we going to go back to Florence in Brussels? Can we assume that Mr. Anderson, the amorous attaché, has not relented in his attempt to turn her head and gain her favors? We'll find out next time. So I'll wrap this up for now. I'll see you all then. Thank you, BookTube.